In this nugget, we continue our discussion of Active Directory, and we're going to talk more about domain controller installation. Although we installed a domain controller in our last nugget, we'll talk a little bit more about some specifics, both using the UI to do things such as adding additional domain controllers, and also how to use PowerShell to install those domain controllers. Another important part of Active Directory is to be able to install a domain controller using the install from media method to save on your WAN traffic. We'll look at that. We'll look at removing domain controllers as well. Maybe you need to decommission some or repurpose them for some reason. We'll take a look at planning an Active Directory upgrade. You can upgrade from Windows Server 2008 to Windows Server 2012 domain controllers. So we'll take a look at some considerations to keep in mind there. And then we'll look at also the global catalog. And we talked about it before in the past a little bit, but I have a whiteboard that is very specific about it, so you have that nailed down. Also, we'll talk a little bit more about trusts and federations. They're really two separate things, but I wanted to make sure that you had some more clarity on those items, even though it's not really part of our exam. Neither is some of the items that I'll talk to you about here, some new features in Active Directory. Most excitingly, I think, is one that's very handy is the recycle bin, the Active Directory recycle bin. And then we'll talk also about SRV records, which are critical to Active Directory, and you need to know how to replace them if they ever get, accidentally deleted, for example. All right, remember from our last nugget that we installed Active Directory domain services and installed a forest root. By the way, I didn't use that term in the last nugget, but the forest root is the first domain in your forest. Okay, so anyway, we installed the forest root, and we went to Manage, Add Roles and Features, and we installed Active Directory Domain Services. After we'd done that, it gives us all kinds of tools over here relating to Active Directory, one of which is Active Directory Users and Computers, where you see that I created an organizational unit and placed a user in that organizational unit. Now, of course, that's using the full GUI. I really just clicked on a bunch of stuff to make all of this happen. I'm a professional clicker, folks. But if we're working with a core installation, we don't really have that luxury, so we're going to have to go to PowerShell instead. Now, of course, we could remotely connect to this machine using a full GUI on Windows 8. That has the remote server administration tools, or we could do this from another Windows Server 2012 machine. That is all possible for us to do this. However, if we're just at the console, we still need to know how we would do the same kind of thing from here, particularly in terms of creating the domain itself and creating a forest. And then in order to install Active Directory domain services, from which we can then launch an Active Directory installation of a domain, we would do install Windows feature, and then the name of it is AD Domain Services, or Active Directory Domain Services. And if we were doing this on a full GUI, we don't have to use the GUI. We could type the same thing from a PowerShell prompt on a full GUI installation, and on that installation, you'd also want to include this last flag here, include management tools. I know it kind of wraps around there, but that's what it says, include management tools. If you do that on core installations, it'll bark at you. It'll just give you a bunch of scattered red text up here saying we don't know what you want. And that's the reason is because there are no management tools like the UI tools that we would have in a full GUI. So on a core installation, you just type that much and press enter. Okay? And then it'll collect data, it'll do its thing, and it doesn't require a reboot until after we install a domain controller. But after this is finished, we'll then have all the binaries installed for Active Directory Domain Services. Alright, then when it's completed, it does give me a warning saying that I don't have automatic updating enabled, and that's okay because for demonstration purposes, I don't like to have an automatic updating turned on so that I can show you updates that I might need to manually install. But anyway, that's okay. Now we got everything installed. Now, the next thing we would need to do then is to install an Active Directory forest. So I would do an install, and then adds forest, and then the domain name, and then whatever the name of the domain is in quotes. Let's just say nuggetlab1.com. I've already got Nuggetlab, so we'll just have a nuggetlab1.com in quotes like this. And I won't keep this domain. This is just for demonstration. We'll normally work just with that nuggetlab.com item. And then it will prompt you for a couple of things. It needs to know the safe mode administrator password. Again, that's what I need if I have to boot into Directory Services Restore mode or safe mode where I don't have Active Directory to log on to an Active Directory account with. So I'll just type something in here. Oh, let's try that again. And then confirm it. And then here it says, do you want to continue with all the next steps? And you could say yes to all, which is, of course, the easiest way to go. And then it's just going to restart the domain controller when it's complete. That's really all it is. It also goes through the same prerequisite checks, make sure that everything's in place. Once this is complete, it'll reboot, and we'll come back to see we then have a domain controller. Also notice before it completes here that, oh, I guess the words went away right before I could finish the recording, but it was telling me that it was also installing DNS, and it will also install Group Policy Management Console. The group policy is what we, of course, use to manage our users and computers and what they can do in an Active Directory environment. And like I said before, it'll continue, and then it'll reboot. Okay, we've installed Active Directory and installed a new forest root there on that core machine. You might be looking at this and saying, hey James, this doesn't look much like a core machine. Well, it's not. It's Windows 8. And on this, I've installed the latest remote server administration tools. Now, let me show you what that's about. Actually, let me close them up here first. But what you can see I've done is I've joined the domain, joined this client computer to the nuggetlab1.com domain. Okay, and then what I've also done here is if we go to our start tiles, after I've installed those administrative tools, you'll notice that they're over here on the right. So I can just click on that, and then I can go here to whatever I need, Active Directory users and computers, and double-click on this, and there we go. We have nuggetlab.com's domain. And from this point forward, I can fully administer it as if it really were a full GUI Server 2008. I can go to my users, I can create a new user if I want to. You know, all this kind of stuff I can do here. The same as if I were sitting at a GUI console. Same with DNS. Remember, DNS was installed at the time that Active Directory Domain Services was also installed when we installed the forest root. There's my nuggetlab1.com domain that we see right here. So we don't need to necessarily explore, all the rest of this too much. You can see all the other tools that are, available there if you want them. I just wanted to point that out so that you could see how we can commonly administer Windows Server 2012 Core Edition. All right, now later on we're going to come back to Nugget Lab 1 because it's just a temporary domain for demonstration purposes right now. But we'll primarily, again, be working with nuggetlab.com, which we see here. And what I want to show you here, though, is the next part of this is adding a domain controller. Seldom, if ever, do you have only a single domain controller in a production environment. I mean, if you have only one and it goes down, then nobody can log on and no authentication can take place. You can't access resources. So usually you're going to have two or more, and then of course enterprises you may have hundreds or even thousands globally. But we'll start with this one that we can see we've already installed. The next thing I would need to do is to go to some other machine like this one, and I don't know if you saw that, but I quickly switched over to a different machine that does not have Active Directory domain services. Again, what I could do is fully use the UI here. And if I were to do that, I would do again very similar to what we did before. I would choose Add Roles and Features. I'm just going to quickly go through this since we've seen this before. And then we would just go ahead and install that Active Directory domain services right here. We'll just add all the features, click Next. Same stuff we looked at earlier. And once that was completed, then when we launch the wizard, we would simply tell it that we want to join an existing domain and make an additional domain controller in that domain. Alright, you can see here that we've now installed Active Directory Domain Services, and I'm going to click on the little More link up here in the upper right, same as we did when we installed the forest root to promote this domain controller. This time we're going to add a domain controller to an existing domain because we've already got the domain in place. We don't need to create the forest root. We did that in the last nugget, but I need to point it to which domain I'm talking about. So it's going to be the nuggetlab.com domain. And then I also, notice that I can't click Next here, I also need to enter in credentials for someone that has access to that domain. So I'm going to click on Change here, and I'm going to enter in trainer@nuggetlab.com, and then the password. Gosh, I fat fingered today. Let's try it again. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and click on Next. Then once we click on Next, we're going to identify that it's going to install DNS, which is fine. I normally recommend that you install DNS on all domain controllers so that you have high availability and it's very low overhead in terms of the additional Active Directory replication data. And then we're also making this a global catalog, and I mentioned last time that this simply means that it's going to have every object in the entire forest. We only have one domain in the forest right now, so it really doesn't provide any additional overhead. If we had multiple domains, we would have to increase the size. That would increase the size of our Active Directory burden, but it's usually not overwhelming. And then we can also make it a read-only domain controller again, which means that you just can't write changes to it. It's a good security measure. I'm going to go ahead and enter in the directory services restore mode password and click on next. And then again, we have the delegation message, nothing that we need to be concerned about. I'm going to come back to this here right here in a moment, but for the time being, we're just going to replicate from any domain controller, but notice that we could have also picked out a specific one. Might be handy if you're in an environment where, a global environment, where you want to choose one that's geographically closer to you, not the one from some other continent over a 56K WAN link or something like that. So we just click on next, and then that's pretty much it. We do have a script that we can view here similar to what I showed you last time, except that this time I'm going to choose the option to install an ADDS domain controller if I need to do this from a command line, which would actually be a PowerShell prompt, because these are PowerShell instructions. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, I'm going to hit previous here to go back to talking about install from media. And I also need to show you some things relating to that. First of all, what really is install from media and what's the purpose of it? What we want to do with this is we want to avoid network traffic. And initially, you don't even need any network connections when you're installing a domain controller from media. You might think, well, how's that possible? Because normally what you have here is, let's say a DC1, a first domain controller. And this is the other computer that you have, and you want that one to be DC2, or in other words, another domain controller. In a conventional installation, for example, if I were to click on install on that wizard we were just using right now, it would just copy all of my Active Directory data from one domain controller to the new domain controller. All my users, my groups, my organizational units, everything would get copied over. However, when you're doing install from media, you don't want to do that. Why? Because it could be that this WAN link here, maybe it's really slow. Maybe it's only 128K. That's really painfully slow in any instance. But if you're a larger organization with hundreds of megabytes or even gigabytes of Active Directory data, it may never make it across that before the connection just times out or fails or has other kinds of problems. So that's a real issue that we want to avoid. So we're going to avoid a large WAN transfer. And then later on, once we use install from media, and this could be on an external drive, a thumb drive, a DVD, anything. What we do is we copy the data instead of over the network. We copy it to whatever this media is here. And then on this new domain controller, we plug that in. Could be, like I said, a thumb drive or something. Or maybe we copy it to the local hard drive here. And then we do install from media, just from the local source, and we never use this WAN link for the original data. Once we've installed it as a domain controller, then only the differences are synced. So, for example, between the time that I made this install from media and installed this domain controller, and then there was maybe some new users created over here. Well, the new users will then be transferred across the WAN link, but otherwise, we can avoid the big burden that's installed right here. So the NTDS util is the command that we'll use for this. It's not a PowerShell item. It does take place in an administrative command prompt. And there are 4 different options for this. One thing you could do is to create full. That means I'm going to take just all the Active Directory data, and I'm going to copy it to this media. And then when this domain controller over here is installed, it'll be a full read-write domain controller. But I could have also opted for a read-only domain controller, which I've talked about previously. And that would mean that this domain controller could not make any writes to Active Directory data, just the way the name implies. I can also do create sysvol full, and that's what I've done in an example that I'll show you here in a moment. And in addition to copying all the Active Directory data, it also copies the sysvol. The sysvol is a special directory in Active Directory, in the file system, that contains important Active Directory items as well as critical types of files necessary to make sure that Active Directory works properly. Other things that are included in that, for example, would be Active Directory's group policy information. We can also create sysvol read-only domain controller. Okay, so if we wanted to have all the sysvol data and make the domain controller read-only, of course that's what we'd do. You can only do this for the same operating system domain controller. So if this is a Windows Server 2012, Win12, then I could not copy that install from media data over to a Windows Server 2008, for example. They would both have to be Win12. So to get this launched, I need the source media first from the originating domain controller. Here I've logged on to the administrative command prompt where I run NTDS util, which is the utility for directory services. Once I get there, it takes me to a special command prompt where I activate an instance NTDS. Then once that's been done, at this prompt I'll type ifm telling it that I want to install from media, and then I tell it that I want to create sysvol full c:\ifm, and you can specify whatever path makes sense to you. I just happen to have a folder there already, so I called it that. Also, I could have done sysvol RODC, or I could have left off sysvol entirely and just typed full or RODC. I've already done this in advance, and you can see here that there's the IFM directory. So if I double click on this, you can see that we've got some things already in place there. It's probably 30 megabytes or so, 36 megabytes worth of data there. That's because there's some baseline data already with Active Directory, even if you don't create any user accounts or organizational units or anything. I've created a single organizational unit and a single user. They don't account for all 36 megabytes there, though. And then under the Active Directory item, you can see there's the ntds.dit file that I mentioned earlier. There's also some registry settings for security and for the system. And then there's the sysvol itself, and there's the name of the domain, and there's scripts. I don't really have any, but you might have startup scripts, log off scripts, that sort of thing. There's also 2 default policies which are identified by unique GUIDs here, and that's the default domain policy and the default domain controller policy, which we'll talk about at a later point in time. So anyway, there's all my Active Directory data, and then what all I have to do is to copy that to a thumb drive, copy it to a CD, an external drive, something like that, that I can get over to that other destination. And once I do that over here, then I could launch this wizard again and let it fly. Now then over here on the destination, this is the computer that I want to be DC Nugget 02, the second domain controller. You can see that I've already copied all the same data over here. There it all is. And then I just go ahead and launch this wizard again to promote this server to a domain controller. And I'm going to go ahead and click on next to the wizard rather quickly because we've already seen this at a previous point in time. Okay, after entering in the password then, and ignoring that particular item regarding delegation, I'm going to install from a path, and I'm going to point it to the C drive where I've copied the install from media location. Once it's found that, it's going to allow me to continue on, and then it's not going to use the network to continue the installation for this. I'm just going to click on next, next, finish, and so on. And we're just going to go through the prerequisites check as usual, and then I'll just click install. Now, everything it's doing now is pulling that data out of the install from media files. Now, my new domain controller is restarted, and I'm going to click on Tools here and go to Active Directory. Go back up to Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers, and we'll see that we do have access to this nuggetlab.com domain. If we go to Domain Controllers, we now see that we have 2, and of course, this is the one that I'm actually looking at here in this graphical user interface, and it's the new one that was created with install from media. Now let me talk to you about another way of actually deploying a domain controller, and that would be to use scripts. Here I have got a script that would deploy a domain controller, and I'll show it to you here in a moment, but it could be very handy to deploy en masse, let's say, a dozen domain controllers. And I might do this because I want to then ship those domain controllers out somewhere, or I want to keep them all in a server farm where I have a very productive network and lots of users that I want to service. So I would have a script possibly to install and deploy multiple domain controllers. Now, you don't just double-click on that because you can't double-click on PowerShell scripts because they're potentially so dangerous. This could be a very malicious payload that could be launched. So Microsoft just doesn't allow that. So what I could do, though, is to launch the script by a command line, though. But in order to do that, I'd have to, first of all, know if they're even allowed. So I'll type in, actually, PowerShell. I have to go to PowerShell first, and I'll type in execution policy, and it'll tell me that scripts are restricted right now, as I suspected. That's the default. So what I would need to do is to allow the script to run. So I would type set, and then execution policy, and then I would set one of several different options. Restricted is already set, but I can also choose all signed, and I would type all signed. Okay, that would mean that only scripts that are digitally signed would be able to run, and the signature would have to be a trusted signature. So kind of inherently, they would be trusted scripts. I could also do remote signed, and that's a little bit more of a common item. And that would mean that any scripts that I create locally will be able to run without a signature. But anything that I download from elsewhere, such as the internet, will have to have a trusted signature. Or for our own demonstration purposes now, I could run unrestricted. Okay. The next thing I would do then is I'm currently in the directory where we have the script, but you always have to type the path, or if you're currently in the directory that you want to run the script from, you have to do a // and then I would do addc dot. Did I type all the D's? No, I'm missing one. addc. I should have named that something easier. Anyway, and then ps1. And then once it launches, it asks me for domain credentials, so of someone who can do this. And that would be a domain administrator in this case. And then the safe mode administrator password. And we have to, again, confirm that. And then it launches and installs itself just the same way as if we had typed install ADDS domain controller from the command line. It's just that any other parameters that we want are in the script. So that's pretty much all I'm going to show you for here, because other than this, it's pretty much the same as any other installation. All right, now let's talk about how to uninstall Active Directory or uninstall a domain controller. Here we just simply go up to Manage and then Remove Roles and Services. It's going to tell me when I try to do this that I have to first demote the domain controller. So I'll deselect Active Directory domain services and remove those features. And then here we get the message that we can't do this quite yet because we haven't demoted the domain controller. So I'll just click demote this domain controller. Kind of handy little item right there. And then we can also choose force the removal of this domain controller. You don't want to do that if you can help it. Usually we only do that in lab environments where, for example, the original domain controller that we installed, let's say, let me go back over here. This one, that's my original domain controller, which has a record of both these domain controllers in it. If this one were offline or it caught on fire or we just re-imaged it or we just didn't have it anymore, then this wizard here on DC Nugget 2 would never be able to complete. Okay, in this case, we could force the removal of the domain controller even though it does not have a connection with the original DC Nugget 1. Okay. Anyway, we'll go ahead and click on Next, and then we'll just go ahead and proceed with this removal. Since it's going to affect DNS and remove the global catalog server, it's just telling us here that we have to make sure that we still have DNS in the global catalog elsewhere in the environment if we still want the domain to provide service. So we'll go ahead and proceed with the removal. Now, there's not really a delegation, but we'll leave that checked anyway. And then we'll just go ahead and enter in our password now. This will be the new local administrator password. And then we'll click on Next. And then that's pretty much it. We just click on Demote. So I'm going to go ahead and allow that one to demote. We would also have to reboot this one. After the reboot, it will be a member of the domain, but it will no longer be a domain controller. All right, with a little time going by here, we see that DC Nugget 02 is no longer there. That's because I demoted it, as I showed you. This is the core machine that I ran the script on. You see that it has now joined the domain, or become a domain controller. I forgot to rename it, so it's still got the convoluted name that Microsoft gave it. But regardless, here it is. This is the core machine. In order to uninstall Active Directory here, what I have to do? Well, I'll just go to PowerShell, and then I'll do uninstall. Pretty much the reverse of installing. It would just do uninstall -adds domain controller. Okay, and then we'll press enter, and then it'll take us through the rest of the steps pretty well here, and it's pretty effective at how it does its job. All we have to do again is to provide the local administrator password. And to confirm that, this is going to be the local administrator password for the for this particular machine after it's removed as a domain controller. Once again, it will also still, however, be a member of the domain. Now, when it comes to planning an Active Directory upgrade, for example, if you're a Windows Server 2008 domain controller and you want to go to 2012, what do you have to do? Well, first thing, you'll just have to have the same normal, usual prerequisites that you would have to do for minimum hardware requirements to a Windows Server 2012 installation anyway, and we talked about those earlier in this series. And then for the domain controller upgrade, I just linked a TechNet article here, which has some verbiage on this whole thing, but I'm going to kind of compress what we need to know here in this whiteboard. First of all, there's the forest functional level. One thing that's kind of weird about that is there's no functional changes, no new features really, in the Windows Server 2012 forest functional level. In the past, when you upgrade the domain or forest functional level, it turns on new features. With the forest functional level here in this version, really nothing new about it, but they still require that you upgrade to the newest forest functional level before you upgrade your existing domain controllers to Windows Server 2012. Okay, let me write that in better. Win 12 domain controllers. All right. Now, how do you do that? Well, you do an AD prep / forest prep, and you do that from the installation media, and you also have to do that as an administrator, in this case, really, an enterprise administrator. For the domain functional level, it's pretty simple. There's a little bit of an article right there, but the main idea here is you just need to have Windows Server 2003 domain functional level or greater. One of the cool things about the new Windows Server 2012 domain functional level is that you'll get a new feature called dynamic access control and also something called Kerberos armoring. But dynamic access control has a little bit more detail here for you. It's not part of our current exam, so I don't delve into it too much, but it's pretty exciting, and so I want to share a little bit about it with you and just go slightly off topic here just for a moment. Let's say that this is our folder. Looks like Frankenstein's boot. But anyway, this is our folder right here, and maybe we're in a healthcare facility. You know, we have, I don't know, x-rays, brain scans, MRIs, that kind of thing. Maybe, I don't know what file format they use, but let's just say they're JPEGs. Now, let's say that we had this folder contains all of these brain scans and x-rays and stuff, and we only want people who are doctors, so I'll say doctor, maybe we created a group called doctors, and emergency room workers, people that work on that floor in the emergency room, for example, to be able to access this folder. Now, what have we done in the past? We can't say and. Okay, we can't say you have to be a member of the doctor's group and the emergency room group. What we've done in the past is we've had to create another group. If we want both of those, have to create another group and nest both of these groups inside of it. And I'll just call this one, for lack of any imagination, the X-ray group. These are the people that are allowed to access the X-rays because they happen to be a member of both of these groups. Well, that gets very cumbersome. This is something kind of interesting. We wind up with something called token bloat when we do that, because especially in larger organizations, we get all of these and/or kind of situations, and you have to create all these special case groups. You have to keep creating group on top of group. For example, Microsoft has 90,000 employees, but guess what? They have 600,000 groups in their Active Directory. Well, with dynamic access control, we can now create a new situation in which we don't have to create a separate group for that. On the properties of relating to this folder here, we can say, yeah, you can be a member of both the doctor's group and the emergency room group. And if you're a member of both of those, you can access this folder. You can even get more involved than that. We can say, you're only allowed to access that folder if you're a member of both of these groups, and the computer that you're viewing them on is in the lab technician's computer, computer 27 or something like that. So that's just a little bit about what we get here with dynamic access control, and it's a pretty cool feature. Now here you can see I'm on a Windows Server 2008 domain controller, and I've already created a lot of organizational units and users, and I really need to retain all of these when I do my upgrade. So first thing, let's identify if we're at the proper domain functional level. I can right-click on the domain up here at nuggetlab.com and choose Raise Domain Functional Level. That's a little bit misleading because I can't raise it because it's already at the highest level, but it says Windows Server 2008 R2 Domain Functional Level. I'm fine with that. Now the next thing I would need to do is to access Active Directory domains and trusts, and you can see that here. This is found on Administrative Tools Start menu, and I can right-click here and again choose Raise Forest Functional Level, and we see that the Forest Functional Level is also at 2008 R2. Okay, that's okay for now. That's all I need in order to do the upgrade. After I've done the upgrade, if I want to, I can raise the Forest Functional Level and/or the Domain Functional Level to get some of those features that I talked to you about previously. Now, the other thing I need to do is to do the Forest Prep as well as the Domain Prep. Here's the CD, or the DVD installed for Windows Server 2012. I've navigate to the support and AD prep only to show you these files. We don't really do much with these directly. You can't do anything with them in the UI. For example, the tool we need is AD prep, but don't just double click on that because you have to run that with parameters when you do it from the command line. Then there's also all these different things here, and you can kind of tell by the names there. They modify the schema is what they do. That's the whole job, is to do that. So I'm just going to do an AD prep, ADPREP space / and then Forest Prep, okay, and press enter. Notice that I'm on an administrator command prompt here. Then it asks me, am I sure I want to do this? And I'll go ahead and say C, type C to confirm, okay, and then I'll press enter to continue. And then you see that it's doing all of its business here. Now you see that it has gone ahead and completed this. By the way, you only need to do this on one domain controller. Because it'll replicate all these schema changes to all of the other domain controllers. So do this on one and you're good for the rest of the organization. And then the other thing I would do is AD prep. You could do this also as space / domain prep. And we have successfully updated that information. Okay, so that's really all there is to that. Now, once that's been done, we're ready to perform an upgrade. And here I'll just go to the file system, and I'm just going to do this from the DVD here. I'm just going to double click on it. Of course, it gives me this item. I'll click on yes, and we'll go ahead and launch an installation. And since I've already now upgraded the forest functional level and the domain functional level as an enterprise admin, I'll click on install now. And it should not give me any hiccups here. If I did not do the updating of the forest and domain functional level, then it would give you an error message in the installation, because the prerequisite checks are actually pretty good here. You can go online to install updates now, and they recommend that you do that. You do have to have an active internet connection in order to make that work. What this is going to do is not going to download like the latest drivers for your video card or something like that. It's only going to download things that are related to the installation. You know, it does say hardware drivers, but that's only if, let's say, a specific video card causes some big problem during the installation and Microsoft's been made aware of it. Then they will post on their site that there's an update to those drivers if they're available that may help to make your update process more graceful. Here, then also choose whether or not we want core or full UI. By the way, you can really only do a full UI, because if you started off with a GUI, then you have to install a GUI here when we do the upgrade. All right, there's no way to upgrade from a full GUI to a core. All right, so we'll click on next. Like I said before, earlier in this series, you saw how we can convert that after the fact, after we performed our installation. But for the time being, we're just going to continue on through the wizard. And of course, we're doing an upgrade. Okay, we're not going to do a custom installation where we might format C:, and install from scratch. We want to do an upgrade for sure. Upgrades are done from within your current operating system. You almost always get this message in the upgrade, and it just says make sure your application vendors support 2012. We're okay with that. I don't really have any applications installed, so I don't know why they give that to me. But we'll just go ahead and click on next, then it will start to do the rest of the normal installation. Alright, and here we're back. The machine restarted. I just now logged on, and now we can go to Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers, and see that all our accounts are intact. There's my nuggetlab.com domain. There's the AZ Phoenix. I think I was looking at admins earlier for the users accounts. And there we go. Still have all our same user accounts. Okay, so pretty simple and fairly painless upgrade. Now, I've talked about global catalogs a few different times here, and I want to get specific about what this actually is and what benefit it provides. First of all, as I said before, it's a full copy of the host domain's objects. So if we have a multiple domain environment here, for example, let's just take this half of the diagram. If I've got nuggetlab.com, then the global catalog contains all of nuggetlab.com's objects in full. Okay, if that's the only domain I've got in the entire forest, then that's really the end of the story, and there's really nothing else to it. However, if I have multiple domains, then it's going to take a partial read-only copy of other domains in the forest. So when we take a look at that, this global catalog here will also have user accounts, groups, any other Active Directory object from east.nuggetlab.com, as well as from west.nuggetlab.com, but it's kind of a little bit more of a, let's say, a shell of the account that's down there. It's not the complete object down here, the same as a domain controller down here would contain, but it has most of the searchable objects that you would normally find. Okay, and the reason why that's useful is because it gives us these different benefits. First of all, it's going to give us simpler searches across domains. For example, if I wanted to find out, maybe I'm a user and I'm just searching for a specific user down here, and I think their name begins with, P. Jones, something like that. I don't know if it's P. Jones or P. Johnson, something like that. I can just type PJ and then do a search against the objects that are from this domain. But guess what? It doesn't actually go down here to look for this domain controller and then perform a query against that domain controller. It doesn't have to. Because the domain controller up here that's a global catalog, it'll just search against the global catalog and not bother contacting this domain controller down here, and it'll immediately be able to give search results related to what it finds in the global catalog, and it can find that P. Jones account. So there's no need to contact the source domain controllers, is what I'm saying there. Also, we have user principal name authentication. We might have access to resources down here. Let me put Frankenstein's boot back in here. And I might have, been granted access to a resource down here. All right. So these domain controllers down here as well, they're probably also going to have one or more global catalogs. Usually I'll have many of them. And then what will happen here is if I'm a user from up here at nuggetlab.com, at nuggetlab.com, let's just say J Jones. I'm not very creative on names today, but it's jjones at nuggetlab.com is my user principal name. Okay, we talked about that before as well. Then when I try to access that, then it'll be able to look up my user principal name because that's part of the global catalog. Again, it may not have to go all the way back up here and contact these domain controllers because it already has a record of my user principal name there. And it can at least authenticate if that's a legitimate user principal name. And it'll also validate any forest objects that I have. And this is very similar, just uses the same idea there. It just looks up items that are in the global catalog to identify whether or not it's a legitimate object somewhere else in that forest. And then universal group membership information is also very important. We'll talk more about groups at a later point in time, but the basic idea here is I can create what's called a universal group, and it can contain objects from my own domain as well as objects from any other domain in the forest. And if we have a forest trust here, for example, it could take objects from this domain over here. Well, the global catalog, if we're in a complete trust relationship here where we got a forest-wide trust going on, then we could have groups in here or users in this group from anywhere else throughout the entire forest, and we need to make sure that the global catalog can validate the information in that universal group membership. Also, in a single domain, this is just relating to mostly replication. In a single domain, there's really no burden. In other words, going back to my domains over here, if I only had, clear up a little bit here, if I only had this one domain, then the global catalog does not contain any extra data. Okay, so there's no burden involved in that. But if we truly do have multiple domains in separate namespaces here and everything, and we got a full transitive trust going all the way across here, then the global catalog here is going to contain objects from every single one of these domains on this side and every single one of the domains from this side. Then we have to start thinking about replication. Maybe Accusource.net is a substantially larger organization than NuggetLab.com. Well, if I only had my own global catalog on this side of things in this namespace to worry about, maybe it would be pretty small and not really that much to consider in terms of replication. But maybe Accusource.net, maybe they have 100,000 users, plus the computer accounts, plus group accounts, and so on. Well, that could substantially add to my global catalog in any replication that I have. It's not really part of the current exam to consider that in terms of where you place them and stuff like that, but you may have to consider that more carefully. So, for example, over here, if my sales at, actually, let's go over here. If my West office is a tiny, tiny branch office that has a 56K WAN link, and I've got to replicate all of this stuff to a global catalog server, because I can have a global catalog server, global catalog down here as well, then that would really be burdensome over my slow WAN link. Now, the way you configure a domain controller, if it's not already set up as a global catalog, is you go to Active Directory Sites and Services, and from here I can select to make a domain controller a global catalog or not make it a global catalog server. So here's DC Nugget 1. It's actually my only live domain controller right now. And I right-click on NTDS Settings underneath that domain controller, choose Properties, and then here's the checkbox where you can see you can make it or not make it a global catalog based on the checkmark. Now, since this is the only global catalog server I have, if I were to somehow inadvertently deselect this item, notice that I get this warning here saying that, hey, just so you know, nobody's going to be able to log on if you clear this checkbox. So I'm going to say no to this, because I want to leave that checked. Also notice another little curiosity here. It's not part of our current exam or current issues here, but there's a domain controller here, DC Nugget 2. Wait a minute. How come it doesn't have any NTDS settings? That's because domain controllers do not get removed from the list of domain controllers underneath their site name here. So even though I decommissioned that server already, I would have to manually remove it here if I wanted to clean up my view of this. For some strange reason, it's just not automated within Active Directory Sites and Services. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about trusts and federations. We've touched on those previously. However, I do want to point out that neither of those is part of the exam here that we're looking at, the 70-410. So the reason why I'm touching on them here, despite that fact, is because although I've mentioned them in the past, I don't want you to be left with kind of partial information or any kind of fogginess about those, because they're still important in terms of actual practical administration and understanding. So I'm just going to be brief about this, though. And the first part of the trust that we'll take a look at, the first type, is something called an external trust. What would that look like? Let's say that we have two totally separate organizations here, the NuggetLab.com forest and the AccuSource.net forest, and their child domains down here. Now, what we have going on here is we've realized that we need to use this other company as a new partner of some type. So they have users over here that we need to assign to resources like a shared folder over here so that they can access files that we're working on together. So what I'll do is I'll trust this domain over here, and then that way this user can access this shared folder, for example. These, again, are two totally separate forests, and we're manually creating an external trust there. All right, so that's an external trust. The other kind of a trust that I might need to create would be called a shortcut trust. Let's go ahead and take a look at that one here as well as I clean up. In a shortcut trust, let's say I've got this child domain down here, and then branching off of that, I have other domains as well. Okay, so I have several sub-levels of child domains. The top level here, the forest root, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 separate levels down here of a child domain. Now that's okay. If I am all in the same forest, then I might have a resource here, all right, that users can access. So I've got a user account down here. This user, or a group that they belong to, has been granted access to this folder. Now what could happen here, especially on the initial double click of that folder from the user's side of things on their workstation, is they might see an hourglass for a while. It depends on the link speeds between some of these domains and the actual physical connectivity between the domains and so forth. However, what has to happen here is when I double click on it, this domain controller right here, it says, wait a minute, you're talking about a user having access to this that I don't know about, because they're way down here in this deep level, some other domain. So what it has to do is it says, hey, I don't know anything about that user. east.nuggetlab.com, do you know anything about that user? Well, that user says, well, I don't either, but they're still part of our same namespace, so they got to be here somewhere, right? Let's go down another level. Do you know anything about that user? Well, I don't. How about you? I don't. How about you? Oh, I know that user. That's one of mine. So they are then granted access to that folder. Now this takes a little while, again, depending on link speeds and how far down this has to go and so forth. So what we could do is to create a shortcut trust where we manually create a trust between this domain here and this bottom one down here. That way we don't have to do what we call walking the tree here and go all the way through all these other referrals. Then we just make a direct connection to that domain when we need to validate that user. Now, there would also be a realm trust. This can be quite complicated, and it's well outside of our current scope here. But let's say that AccuSource.net was not even a Windows domain. Maybe it was just a Kerberos. We have these called Kerberos realm. You see, Kerberos and domains like we're talking about here are not really strictly a Microsoft invention. Kerberos realms existed actually before Active Directory did. So here, if we have a Kerberos realm that we need to work with, and a lot of universities might be in that situation over here, and here if we've got a corporate Windows Server 2012 domain, we may need to have a partnership here again as well. Well, yeah, there's white paper from Microsoft on how to interoperate with these non-Windows Kerberos realms here, but that's another kind of a connection that you might need to make. And then, of course, there's the one that is easiest in terms of transitivity, and that would be what we call a forest trust. Now, if I created this whole domain over here, for this domain and this whole forest over here with all of its children, and then later on we decided to spin off another division and we created a separate domain over here, but part of our same forest, then we don't have to create any kind of a trust because it's already part of our same forest. Even though the names are different, it has the exact same kind of access as any of my child domains do down here. On the other hand, let's say it's a merger. So this is our organization, and we bought this organization. Then what happens? Well, for that way, you would simply create what we call a forest trust, and that would give us the same transitivity across all of our domains as if they had originally been created in the same forest in the first place. And then finally, a federation is not really a trust at all. I kind of put it in the same context earlier as the same kind of an idea, but it's really not. What a federation allows you to do And again, we're well outside of our scope for this exam, but this allows me to access certain, let's say, applications. Maybe a lot of times it's associated with ASP.NET applications. So maybe AccuSource.net has this application that I needed to access. Maybe it's an inventory control thing, and maybe I'm their supplier over here at NuggLab.com, and I want to get into their inventory control to see when they're running low on parts so that I can ship them more parts. Well, rather than creating a trust here, what we could create is a federation to where I could make a claim that I'm a specific user from this organization, and then when I claim that to this organization over here, they can say we can confirm that you're from NuggLab.com, and we've already established a federation where we know that that's a good user account, and so we'll allow it to continue on. And it can be quite complicated, but that's the basic idea of how it works. This does not have any transitivity. It does not even go beyond the application if I wanted to. That doesn't mean that you can access any of my other resources, any of my other servers, my applications, my intranet web pages, anything, just maybe that one specific application. Now let's talk here about SRV records. These are actually entries that appear in DNS, and I'll show you those here shortly. The main thing about them is that they are critical to the proper function of Active Directory. Most of the time, you don't have to worry about it. One of the exam objectives talks something about troubleshooting SRV records. Most of the time, they honestly take care of themselves, because if you have dynamic updates in DNS, and that's the default, then your domain controllers are going to register themselves properly in Active Directory and register their own SRV records. So that's usually not too big of an issue unless someone's gone in there and fiddled with them or tried to get, cute with them and configured stuff that doesn't need configuring. So usually they're okay there. One of the things that they do that's pretty important, though, is that they will locate the domain controllers. Remember, when you have a computer that's joined to the domain and you turn it on, it starts up and it actually logs on to the domain controller. How does it find a domain controller to log on to? Well, through the SRV records. That's how they're more or less advertised to all of your clients. And they're even smart enough to be able to show the client the domain controllers that are closest to them, for example, in their own site, as opposed to using a domain controller on the other side of the planet. Okay, so that's pretty good the way that all works. They can also be used to locate other services, such as you can create an SRV record for link services. This is communications type of a server. Timothy Warner here at CBT Nuggets has just a smashing new series on link server. So you might want to look that up. But that's just some other things. You can also use them besides Active Directory specifically. So to access my SRV records, just to look at them, I'm going to go to Tools and DNS, because DNS does hold those SRV records. Here you can see I've got a forward lookup zone, and I've got an underscore msdcs.nuggetlab.com, and then I've got under nuggetlab.com a delegation. Notice how it's kind of a little bit grayed out. Let me take focus off. You can see it's kind of grayed out. That's a delegation to this. Now, the reason why this is significant is because you can replicate everything that appears in a specific lookup zone. Like, I'll right-click here and choose Properties, and I'll show you. I can replicate this to all DNS servers in this domain. Okay? And just keep that in mind. Now, take a look at this one up here. With this zone, if I look at it, it's to all DNS servers in this forest. The significance of that is if I have a multi-forested environment, then I'll need to replicate everything up here to all of the other DNS servers, even throughout all of my child domains and other namespaces and everything. So this will have to be kind of universally available across all of my domains in the forest. Now, the significance of this is where I find, of course, you can see domain controllers and domain controllers in specific sites. Okay, and then it would identify my LDAP and my Kerberos servers, which of course are the same ones, dcnugget1.nuggetlab.com. Okay, and then we would also have, it also appears here under just TCP. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that these appear, but this is how it's going to make available. The domain here, this is a global unique identifier. This is kind of the way the operating system actually sees the domain, is through this unique identifier, and this is where we can find and locate a domain controller for that domain. I've only got one out. The other ones that I used to have, I decommissioned all of them, so I've only got the one domain controller now. Otherwise, we'd see DC Nugget 2 and 3 and whatever else we would have. So anyway, that's the significance of having our particular SRV records, is that they make that service, hence SRV, available to our clients when they do things such as log on or try to do some search against Active Directory, all of that sort of thing here, okay? And then we also see these that are replicated throughout the local domain, because each domain will have one or more global catalog servers. And again, they're also Kerberos and LDAP servers as well. Now, in terms of troubleshooting, let's take a look at if I were to do something really stupid. Let's say that it was my first day on the job as an Active Directory administrator, and I looked through all of this stuff and I said, DNS, I'm not really quite sure what all these things are, SRVs. I thought only host records were important, so these probably don't really mean anything. I'm just going to go ahead and delete these things here. And I should want to delete them. Well, why not? Okay, first day on the job, what have I got to lose, right? Well, I may have just lost that job if I'm not careful, because that's going to be critical to my clients being able to find logon servers and Active Directory services to provide other functions. Now, how can I recreate those records? Well, if I realized I made a mistake, I could right-click here, choose new. Oh, I guess I have to go to other records, and then it gets complicated. Watch this. I go down to SRV, create record. Well, now I don't know what to type. What's this priority? I don't know. What am I supposed to do with this? This is not a good way to troubleshoot this, folks. What I would recommend that you do if you ever get into a situation where someone's fiddling around with your SRV records, and I'm trying to get my little start, yeah, there it goes, start menu, is I would just go to a command prompt, and I'm just going to go to a administrator command prompt by right-clicking on it and choosing Run as Administrator. And then there's a few different ways of actually doing this. Many of them work. And I promise you, I'll only show the ones that work, okay? Okay, so what we would do here is, actually, let me show you something that used to work, but you don't want to use anymore because it's deprecated. There's a netdiag /fix. It used to be that on previous versions of Windows, this would do it. Well, it's not even there anymore. So don't use that one. There's another tool that is very handy, and some people mistakenly tell you will fix the problem. It doesn't do it either, though, and that would be dcdiag /fix. You'd think that would make sense because it says domain controller diagnostics, and you want to fix what's wrong. So you'd think that would do it. Well, this will run various tests and make sure that Active Directory itself is operating properly. It doesn't really touch this, however. So if I refresh the screen here, for example, well, I'm still messed up. So that's not looking so good. So here, let me clear the screen. What you want to do now under current version of Windows is nltest /dsregdns. Okay. Oh, I got a typo in there. Sorry about that. dsregdns. So if you got that, all right, we'll press enter here. The command's completed successfully. I'll refresh the screen. Voila. There go my SRV records, and that's a very handy thing to be able to restore all this, because if you have to do all this manually, it will drive you insane. Now then, finally, I wanted to talk to you about some new features in Active Directory, and there's some specific details on these two links here. Now, the reason why I don't really go into a lot of detail here immediately, at least, is because none of this is part of the exam objectives, except for possibly the fact that we don't have DC Promo anymore. The rest of this is I'm only providing it because I think you'll find it useful and interesting and actually practical in some instances. So, first of all, with DC Promo, as I mentioned earlier, it's deprecated. It's not any longer something that you use to install a domain controller. It's built into the UI, and you've seen me do that a number of times. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that if you want to, you could still use it. Yes, you could, with the /unattend. And the reason why you would want to do that is maybe you've got, and then unattend, and then you would point it to, a file location. And the reason why I'm pointing this is because some people have come up with a great investment in coming up with custom files to do a staged installation of their domain controllers, or a kind of a pre-packaged installation. And if they're still invested in their DC Promo scripts, or unattend files actually, then you could still use those, but we're trying to get away from those. Okay, so at least in terms of exam purposes, the idea that we want to understand is that it's deprecated and you don't use it anymore. There's also AD prep and other showstoppers. In other words, any other prerequisites that might stop a successful installation of a domain controller are now very well handled in the prerequisites check. Microsoft has mentioned publicly that one of their common calls for support services has been problems with DC Promo in previous versions of Windows, and they want to try to get rid of that as much as they can. AD prep is something that you saw me do manually in an upgrade from Windows Server 2008. However, there would be this situation. What if I had a new Windows Server 2012 server here, and an existing Windows Server 2008 domain controller over here? If I installed this new, and then I decided to do a DC Promo, it would copy over, my Active Directory data from Windows Server 2008. Now, rather than doing a manual AD prep for forest prep or domain prep, it would do that automatically for me as part of the installation of that new domain controller over here. There's also Active Directory Administrative Center. This has something I haven't really shown you yet, but it has UI improvements. It also has something called a PowerShell history. Let me show you that just briefly here. To access the Active Directory Administrative Center, you go to Tools and Active Directory Administrative Center. And what we'll see happen here is that it gives us just a different kind of a UI for working with objects that we would commonly deal with. As you first look at this, it gives you some help here. These are just links to web articles that you can use. I can also go to specific locations. For example, here's my Joe user account in this domain that I'd created at a previous point in time. What I could do with that is to reset his password, for example. Maybe I'll do that. So I'll just enter in a password. You can see it's just nothing that you couldn't figure out on your own, I'm sure. However, it's just a different kind of a UI here. Okay. Now, so I click OK here, and the next thing I wanted to show you, though, is down here. Look at this, Windows PowerShell history. You see what I just did there? I set a password for that user. This is very handy because I might want to then say, you know what? I don't know what the PowerShell stuff is that I have to type in to change a user account's password. Well, now I know what the commandlet is. Set AD account password. And then I enter in the what we call the distinguished name of that user. Common name is what you call this. Common name equals, and then the name of the user. OU, the organizational unit he's in, is Nugget Lab users and NLab users. And then the domain component is Nugget Lab, and then the other domain component is com. So that's how I would type that in. There's no spaces in that except for the Joe user part. That's why it's in quotation marks too. And then I enter in the password, a new password, system security secure string, and then so on. So if I wanted to script this for the future, then I could copy that and then put that into a PowerShell PS1 file, and then be able to use that at some point in the future for maybe other accounts or some kind of bulk operation, that sort of thing. So the PowerShell history is a very useful part of this whole thing now in Atom. Now, another very handy feature that actually debuted in Server 2008 R2 is the Active Directory Recycle Bin, allowing you to recover objects that you'd accidentally deleted. Now it has a UI, however, and in order to enable the functionality of that, what we need to do is to go to our tools here, and then we need to go to a special PowerShell item, the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell. Now, once we're within this, we can enter in the correct syntax to enable this, and it takes a little bit of time to type it all out, so I'll show it to you when I'm done. I'm also going to include it in the PowerShell cheat sheet, so you don't have to write it down yourself. And then here is the syntax that you would enter in to get that Active Directory Recycle Bin enabled. Now, this is very useful if you want to do this. This is something you do forest-wide, by the way, so you only have to really do it one place to enable it across your enterprise. If you don't want to use PowerShell, guess what? It's actually even easier than that. Why do things the hard way, right? I'm going to go back to Active Directory Administrative Center and check this out. It used to be, even in 2008, you could enable the Active Directory Recycle Bin, but you had to go through kind of the dark arts of Active Directory to be able to make it work, and you'd have to use ntdsutil to recover your objects and so on. Here now, I can just right-click on the domain under Atom and choose Enable Recycle Bin. Are you sure? Once it's been enabled, you can't disable it. Well, I don't know why I'd want to disable it, but I'll click OK. And now it's able to do this for the forest. As I said before, it's a forest-wide operation. And once all the other domain controllers have refreshed the fact that I've turned that on, it'll now be available to us. Now then, how do I handle a deletion of a user account? Let me go to my Nugget Lab users here, for example. And what if I wanted to just go here and right-click on this user? So I'll just delete that user. Are you sure you want to delete the user? Yes. Or no, wait a minute. Oh, that's my boss's account. Ooh, that was probably a bad idea to delete that one. Maybe I need to go back up here now and refresh the screen here a little bit. So sometimes you have to refresh these things. Now notice that there's a deleted objects item that appears here. So if I go into this, there's my user account, right-click here, and I can restore it or restore it to a different OU. Maybe they're not a member of Nugget Lab users anymore. Maybe now they're a member of, the Tucson office organizational unit or something like that. But I'll just click restore, And there we go. Now what do? I go back up to Nugget Lab users. There's my account. Now this is actually a step up above what we used to do in old Active Directory as well, because you used to have to do something called Tombstone reanimation, but it would not include all of the attributes. Now this still includes all of the attributes, the password, everything. It's a very, very handy feature to have. I've probably over-explained it for our current exam purposes, but it's just too nice to have to bypass it without explaining it. So then I'll be quick with the rest of this. Activation now takes place with Active Directory. In the past, we would have to get key management servers, and all of our clients in the organization would activate against the KMS, and then it would kind of interoperate with Microsoft. So that instead of each individual machine activating the way we would normally do on, let's say, a home computer, they all activated to a KMS server instead. Now they can all do that via Active Directory, which is much more integrated, although it only works with current versions of Windows. Also, dynamic access control improvements. There's just some improvements involved in that. It's a little bit more sensible in the way they've done that. Also, virtualizing DCs. This I really like a lot. It used to be that what would happen is, let's say we have, here, let me go to Hyper-V here. Here I've got a lot of my different domain controllers here, and I've kind of shut some of them off, but, I've got this one going on right here. Well, what if I were to go back, this is my current state right here. What if I were to go back to a previous point in time, like last year? Maybe this was a snapshot made last year or something like that. I mean, it wasn't, but let's just say it was. This could cause big problems with Active Directory, and without going into a lot of detail with it, it would cause Active Directory synchronization to have big problems. Because there might have been an object that I deleted way back when, that now current domain controllers would say, oh, that object is actually current, and so it won't get deleted. There's all kinds of inconsistencies could happen with that. Well, now they've changed the way that this virtualization takes place. So there's a new property that is involved in that will prevent that kind of unsynchronization from taking place. And then briefly, some additional features for Active Directory new stuff. There's now a UI for something called fine-grained password policies. In the past, we used to have a single domain, for example, and then everybody in that domain would have to have the same password policy in terms of length, complexity, expiration, things like that. Well, in Windows Server 2008, you could have fine-grained passwords, but you had to do this in kind of, again, the dark arts of Active Directory. Now there's a UI so that you can set up separate password policies within different parts of a single domain's Active Directory. Also, there's flexible and secure tunneling, just some improvements made in that. There's also Active Directory Federation Services, which was now included in Server 2012, whereas you had to add it on to 2008. There's also domain join via direct access, which is a really kind of a VPN on steroids, and just now you can join to the domain using direct access, whereas that was not possible before. In this nugget, we talked about Active Directory, and we continued our discussion about domain controller installations, except that we did some additional things. We added additional domain controllers using the UI, for example, as opposed to setting up the original one, the forest root. We also saw how to do that in PowerShell. There's very important items that are included for you there on the PowerShell cheat sheet, so you have knowledge of those. There's also install from media to save yourself network traffic. Remember, we can really take advantage of that to make sure we don't use too much WAN traffic. Also, we talked about removing DCs, both from the command line as well as the UI. We looked at planning an Active Directory upgrade. This is something you can do from Server 2008 to 2012. Fortunately, a lot of it's taken care of for you in the wizard that goes on there, but you still have to do things such as AD prep in this instance. And then we looked at the global catalog for clarity, as well as some trusts and federations information. We looked at what's new in Active Directory, although again, that's not part of the exam, neither is trusts and federations directly. And then we looked at SRV records, and more importantly, how to replace them if they ever get deleted. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.